Chapter 16, Part 1 of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolina. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 16, Moguls, Ottoman Turks, Part 1. From the petty quarrels of a city and her suburbs, from the cowardice and discord of the fallen Greeks, I shall now ascend to the victorious Turks, whose domestic slavery was ennobled by martial discipline, religious enthusiasm, and the energy of the national character. The rise and progress of the Ottomans, the present sovereigns of Constantinople, are connected with the most important scenes of modern history, but they are founded on a previous knowledge of the great eruption of the Moguls and the Tartars, whose rapid conquests may be compared with the primitive convulsions of nature, which have agitated and altered the surface of the globe. I have long since asserted my claim to introduce the nations, the immediate or remote authors of the fall of the Roman Empire; nor can I refuse myself to those events, which, from their common magnitude, will interest a philosophic mind in the history of blood. From the spacious highlands between China, Siberia, and the Caspian Sea, the tide of emigration and war has repeatedly been poured. These ancient seats of the Huns and Turks were occupied in the 12th century by many pastoral tribes, of the same descent and similar manners, which were united and led to conquest by the formidable Zingis. In his ascent to greatness, that barbarian, whose private appellation was Temugin, had trampled on the necks of his equals. His birth was noble, but it was the pride of victory that the prince or people deduced his seventh ancestor from the immaculate conception of a virgin. His father had reigned over 13 hordes, which composed about 30 or 40,000 families. Above 2/3 refused to pay tithes or obedience to his infant son, and at the age of 13 Temugin fought a battle against his rebellious subjects. The future conqueror of Asia was reduced to fly and to obey, but he rose superior to his fortune, and in his 40th year he had established his fame and dominion over the circumjacent tribes. In a state of society in which policy is rude and valor is universal, the ascendant of one man must be founded on his power and resolution to punish his enemies and recompense his friends. His first military league was ratified by the simple rites of sacrificing a horse and tasting of a running stream. Temugin pledged himself to divide with his followers the sweets and the bitters of life, and when he had shared among them his horses and apparel, he was rich in their gratitude and his own hopes. After his first victory he placed 70 cauldrons on the fire, and 70 of the most guilty rebels were cast headlong into the boiling water. The sphere of his attraction was continually enlarged by the ruin of the proud and the submission of the prudent, and the boldest chieftains might tremble when they beheld, encased in silver, the skull of the Khan of Caraites, who, under the name of Prester John, had corresponded with the Roman pontiff and the princes of Europe. The ambition of Temugin condescended to employ the arts of superstition, and it was from a naked prophet, who could ascend to heaven on a white horse, that he accepted the title of Zingis, the most great, and the divine right to the conquest and dominion of the earth. In a general Kurultai, or diet, he was seated on a felt, which was long afterwards revered as a relic, and solemnly proclaimed Great Khan, or Emperor of the Moguls and Tartars. Of these kindred, though rival names, the former had given birth to the imperial race, and the latter has been extended by accident or error over the spacious wilderness of the north. The code of laws which Zingis dictated to his subjects was adapted to the preservation of a domestic peace and the exercise of foreign hostility. The punishment of death was inflicted on the crimes of adultery, murder, perjury, and the capital thefts of a horse or ox; and the fiercest of men were mild and just in their intercourse with each other. The future election of the great Khan was vested in the princes of his family and the heads of the tribes, and the regulations of the chase were essential to the pleasures and plenty of a Tartar camp. The victorious nation was held sacred from all servile labours, which were abandoned to slaves and strangers, and every labour was servile except the profession of arms. The service and discipline of the troops, who were armed with bows, scimitars, and iron maces, and divided by hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, were the institutions of a veteran commander. Each officer and soldier was made responsible, under pain of death, for the safety and honour of his companions, and the spirit of conquest breathed in the law that peace should never be granted, unless to a vanquished and suppliant enemy. But it is in the religion of Zingis that best deserves our wonder and applause. The Catholic inquisitors of Europe, who defended nonsense by cruelty, might have been confounded by the example of a barbarian, who anticipated the lessons of philosophy, and established by his laws a system of pure theism and perfect toleration. His first and only article of faith was the existence of one God, the author of all good, who fills by his presence the heavens and earth, which he has created by his power. The Tartars and Moguls were addicted to the idols of their peculiar tribes, and many of them had been converted by the foreign missionaries to the religions of Moses, of Mohammed, and of Christ. These various systems in freedom and concord were taught and practised within the precincts of the same camp, and the bonze, the imam, the rabbi, the Nestorian, and the Latin priest enjoyed the same honourable exemption from service and tribute. In the mosque of Bokhara the insolent victor might trample the Koran under his horse's feet, but the calm legislator respected the prophets and pontiffs of the most hostile sects. The reason of Zingis was not informed by books. The Khan could neither read nor write, and, except the tribe of the Igors, the greatest part of the Moguls and Tartars were as illiterate as their sovereign. The memory of their exploits was preserved by tradition. 68 years after the death of Zingis, these traditions were collected and transcribed. The brevity of their domestic annals may be supplied by the Chinese, Persians, Armenians, Syrians, Arabians, Greeks, Russians, Poles, Hungarians, and Latins, and each nation will deserve credit in the relation of their own disasters and defeats. End of chapter 16, part 1. Recording by Carolina.
Part 2 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, by Edward Gibbon. Chapter 64, Part 2. The arms of Zingis and his lieutenants successively reduced the hordes of the desert, who pitched their tents between the wall of China and the Volga, and the Mogul emperor became the monarch of the pastoral world, the lord of many millions of shepherds and soldiers, who felt their united strength and were impatient to rush on the mild and wealthy climates of the south. His ancestors had been the tributaries of the Chinese emperors, and Temujin himself had been disgraced by a title of honor and servitude. The court of Pekin was astonished by an embassy from its former vassal, who, in the tone of the king of nations, exacted the tribute and obedience which he had paid, and who affected to treat the Son of Heaven as the most contemptible of mankind. A haughty answer disguised their secret apprehensions, and their fears were soon justified by the march of innumerable squadrons, who pierced on all sides the feeble rampart of the great wall. 90 cities were stormed or starved by the Moguls. 10 only escaped, and Zingis, from a knowledge of the filial piety of the Chinese, covered his vanguard with their captive parents, an unworthy and by degrees a fruitless abuse of the virtue of his enemies. His invasion was supported by the revolt of 100,000 Khitans, who guarded the frontier; yet he listened to a treaty, and the princes of China, 3,000 horses, 500 youths and as many virgins, and a tribute of gold and silk were the price of his retreat. In his second expedition he compelled the Chinese emperor to retire beyond the Yellow River to a more southern residence. The siege of Pekin was long and laborious. The inhabitants were reduced by famine to decimate and devour their fellow citizens. When their ammunition was spent, they discharged ingots of gold and silver from their engines; but the Moguls introduced a mine to the center of the capital, and the conflagration of the palace burned above 30 days. China was desolated by Tartar war and domestic faction, and the 5 northern provinces were added to the empire of Zingis. In the west he touched the dominions of Mohammed, Sultan of Carizme, who reigned from the Persian Gulf to the borders of India and Turkestan, and who, in the proud imitation of Alexander the Great, forgot the servitude and ingratitude of his fathers to the house of Seljuk. It was the wish of Zingis to establish a friendly and commercial intercourse with the most powerful of the Moslem princes, nor could he be tempted by the secret solicitations of the Caliph of Bagdad, who sacrificed to his personal wrongs the safety of the church and state. A rash and inhuman deed provoked and justified the Tartar arms in the invasion of the southern Asia. A caravan of 3 ambassadors and 150 merchants were arrested and murdered at Otrar by the command of Mohammed; nor was it till after a demand and denial of justice, till he had prayed and fasted 3 nights on a mountain, that the Mogul emperor appealed to the judgment of God and his sword. Our European battles, says a philosophic writer, are petty skirmishes if compared to the numbers that have fought and fallen in the fields of Asia. 700,000 Moguls and Tartars are said to have marched under the standard of Zingis and his 4 sons. In the vast plains that extend to the north of the Sihon or Jaxartes, they were encountered by 400,000 soldiers of the Sultan; and in the first battle, which was suspended by the night, 160,000 Carizmians were slain. Mohammed was astonished by the multitude and valor of his enemies. He withdrew from the scene of danger, and distributed his troops in the frontier towns, trusting that the barbarians, invincible in the field, would be repulsed by the length and difficulty of so many regular sieges. But the prudence of Zingis had formed a body of Chinese engineers, skilled in the mechanic arts, informed perhaps of the secret of gunpowder, and capable, under his discipline, of attacking a foreign country with more vigor and success than they had defended their own. The Persian historians will relate the sieges and reduction of Otrar, Cogende, Bokhara, Samarkand, Carizme, Herat, Marau, Nizabur, Balkh, and Kandahar, and the conquest of the rich and populous countries of Transoxiana, Carizme, and Khorasan. The destructive hostilities of Attila and the Huns have long since been elucidated by the example of Zingis and the Moguls; and in this more proper place I shall be content to observe that, from the Caspian to the Indus, they ruined a tract of many hundred miles, which was adorned with the habitations and labors of mankind, and that 5 centuries have not been sufficient to repair the ravages of 4 years. The Mogul emperor encouraged or indulged the fury of his troops; the hope of future possession was lost in the ardor of rapine and slaughter; and the cause of the war exasperated their native fierceness by the pretence of justice and revenge. The downfall and death of the Sultan Mohammed, who expired, unpitied and alone, in a desert island of the Caspian Sea, is a poor atonement for the calamities of which he was the author. Could the Carizmian empire have been saved by a single hero, it would have been saved by his son Gelaleddin, whose active valor repeatedly checked the Moguls in the career of victory. Retreating, as he fought, to the banks of the Indus, he was oppressed by their innumerable host, till, in the last moment of despair, Gelaleddin spurred his horse into the waves, swam one of the broadest and most rapid rivers of Asia, and extorted the admiration and applause of Zingis himself. It was in this camp that the Mogul conqueror yielded with reluctance to the murmurs of his weary and wealthy troops, who sighed for the enjoyment of their native land. Encumbered with the spoils of Asia, he slowly measured back his footsteps, betrayed some pity for the misery of the vanquished, and declared his intention of rebuilding the cities which had been swept away by the tempest of his arms. After he had repassed the Oxus and Jaxartes, he was joined by 2 generals whom he had detached with 30,000 horse to subdue the western provinces of Persia. They had trampled on the nations which opposed their passage, penetrated through the gates of Derbent, traversed the Volga and the desert, and accomplished the circuit of the Caspian Sea by an expedition which had never been attempted and has never been repeated. The return of Zingis was signalized by the overthrow of the rebellious or independent kingdoms of Tartary, and he died in the fullness of years and glory, with his last breath exhorting and instructing his sons to achieve the conquest of the Chinese Empire. The harem of Zingis was composed of 500 wives and concubines, and of his numerous progeny 4 sons, illustrious by their birth and merit, exercised under their father the principal offices of peace and war. Tushi was his great huntsman, Zagatai his judge, Oktai his minister, and Tuli his general, and their names and actions are often conspicuous in the history of his conquests. Firmly united for their own and the public interest, the 3 brothers and their families were content with dependent sceptres, and Oktai, by general consent, was proclaimed Great Khan, or Emperor of the Moguls and Tartars. He was succeeded by his son Gayuk, after whose death the empire devolved to his cousins Mangu and Kublai, the sons of Tuli, and the grandsons of Zingis. In the 68 years of his 4 first successors, the Mogul subdued almost all Asia and a large portion of Europe. Without confining myself to the order of time, without expatiating on the detail of events, I shall present a general picture of the progress of their arms. 1 in the east, 2 in the south, 3 in the west, and 4 in the north. 1. Before the invasion of Zingis, China was divided into 2 empires or dynasties of the north and south, and the differences of origin and interest was smoothed by a general conformity of laws, language, and national manners. The northern empire, which had been dismembered by Zingis, was finally subdued 7 years after his death. After the loss of Pekin, the emperor had fixed his residence at Kaifeng, a city many leagues in circumference, and which contained, according to the Chinese annals, 1,400,000 families of inhabitants and fugitives. He escaped from thence with only 7 horsemen, and made his last stand in a 3rd capital, till at length the hopeless monarch, protesting his innocence and accusing his fortune, ascended a funeral pile and gave orders that, as soon as he had stabbed himself, the fire should be kindled by his attendants. The dynasty of the Song, the native and ancient sovereigns of the whole empire, survived about 45 years the fall of the northern usurpers, and the perfect conquest was reserved for the arms of Kublai. During this interval the Moguls were often diverted by foreign wars, and, if the Chinese seldom dared to meet their victors in the field, their passive courage presented an endless succession of cities to storm and of millions to slaughter. In the attack and defence of places, the engines of antiquity and the Greek fire were alternately employed. The use of gunpowder in cannon and bombs appears as a familiar practice, and the sieges were conducted by the Mahometans and Franks, who had been liberally invited into the service of Kublai. After passing the great river, the troops and artillery were conveyed along a series of canals, till they invested the royal residence of Hamcheu, or Quinsay, in the country of silk, the most delicious climate of China. The emperor, a defenceless youth, surrendered his person and sceptre, and before he was sent in exile into Tartary, he struck 9 times the ground with his forehead, to adore in prayer or thanksgiving the mercy of the great Khan. Yet the war, it was now styled a rebellion, was still maintained in the southern provinces from Hamcheu to Canton, and the obstinate remnant of independence and hostility was transported from the land to the sea. But when the fleet of the Song was surrounded and oppressed by a superior armament, their last champion leapt into the waves with his infant emperor in his arms. "It is more glorious," he cried, to die a prince than to live a slave." 100,000 Chinese imitated his example, and the whole empire, from Tonkin to the Great Wall, submitted to the dominion of Kublai. His boundless ambition aspired to the conquest of Japan. His fleet was twice shipwrecked, and the lives of 100,000 Moguls and Chinese were sacrificed in the fruitless expedition. But the circumjacent kingdoms, Korea, Tonkin, Cochin China, Pegu, Bengal, and Tibet, were reduced in different degrees of tribute and obedience by the effort or terror of his arms. He explored the Indian Ocean with a fleet of 1,000 ships. They sailed in 68 days, most probably to the Isle of Borneo, under the equinoctial line, and though they returned not without spoil or glory, the emperor was dissatisfied that the savage king had escaped from their hands. 2. The conquest of Hindostan by the Moguls was reserved in a later period for the house of Timur, but that of Iran or Persia was achieved by Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Zingis, the brother and lieutenant of the two successive emperors Mangu and Kublai. I shall not enumerate the crowd of sultans, emirs, and atabeks whom he trampled into dust, but the extirpation of the assassins or Ismailians of Persia may be considered as a service to mankind. Among the hills to the south of the Caspian, these odious sectaries had reigned with impunity above 160 years, and their prince or imam established his lieutenant to lead and govern the colony of Mount Libanus, so famous and formidable in the history of the Crusades. With the fanaticism of the Koran, the Ismailians had blended the Indian transmigration and the visions of their own prophets, and it was their first duty to devote their souls and bodies in blind obedience to the Vicar of God. The daggers of his missionaries were felt both in the East and West. The Christians and the Moslems enumerate, and persons multiply, the illustrious victims that were sacrificed to the zeal, avarice, or resentment of the old man, as he was corruptly styled, of the mountain. But these daggers, his only arms, were broken by the sword of Hulagu, and not a vestige is left of the enemies of mankind, except the word assassin, which, in the most odious sense, has been adopted in the languages of Europe. The extinction of the Abbassides cannot be indifferent to the spectators of their greatness and decline. Since the fall of their Seljukian tyrants, the Caliphs had recovered their lawful dominion of Baghdad and the Arabian Irak, but the city was distracted by theological factions, and the commander of the faithful was lost in a harem of 700 concubines. The invasion of the Moguls he encountered with feeble arms and haughty embassies. "On the divine decree," said the Caliph Mostasem, "is founded the throne of the sons of Abbas, and their foes shall surely be destroyed in this world and in the next. Who is this Hulagu that dares to rise against them? If he be desirous of peace, let him instantly depart from the sacred territory, and perhaps he may obtain from our clemency the pardon of his fault." This presumption was cherished by a perfidious vizier, who assured his master that, even if the barbarians had entered the city, the women and children from the terraces would be sufficient to overwhelm them with stones. But when Hulagu touched the phantom, it instantly vanished into smoke. After a siege of 2 months, Baghdad was stormed and sacked by the Moguls, and their savage commander pronounced the death of the Caliph Mostasem, the last of the temporal successors of Mohammed, whose noble kinsman of the race of Abbas had reigned in Asia above 500 years. Whatever might be the designs of the conqueror, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina were protected by the Arabian desert, but the Moguls spread beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, pillaged Aleppo and Damascus, and threatened to join the Franks in the deliverance of Jerusalem. Egypt was lost, had she been defended only by her feeble offspring, but the Mamelukes had breathed in their infancy the keenness of a Scythian air. Equal in valour, superior in discipline, they met the Moguls in many a well-fought field, and drove back the stream of hostility to the eastward of the Euphrates. But it overflowed with resistless violence the kingdoms of Armenia and Anatolia, of which the former was possessed by the Christians and the latter by the Turks. The sultans of Iconium opposed some resistance to the Mogul arms, till Azadin sought a refuge among the Greeks of Constantinople, and his feeble successors, the last of the Seljukian dynasty, were finally extirpated by the Khans of Persia. 3. No sooner had Octai subverted the northern empire of China than he resolved to visit with his arms the most remote countries of the west. 1,500,000 Moguls and Tartars were inscribed on the military roll. Of these the great Khan selected a third, which he entrusted to the command of his nephew Batu, the son of Tuli, who reigned over his father's conquests to the north of the Caspian Sea. After a festival of 40 days, Batu set forwards on this great expedition, and such was the speed and ardor of his innumerable squadrons that in less than 6 years they had measured a line of 90 degrees of longitude, a fourth part of the circumference of the globe. The great rivers of Asia and Europe, the Volga and Kama, the Don and Borysthenes, the Vistula and Danube, they either swam with their horses or passed on the ice, or traversed in leathern boats, which followed the camp, and transported their wagons and artillery. By the first victories of Batu, the remains of national freedom were eradicated in the immense plains of Turkestan and Kipzak. In his rapid progress he overran the kingdoms, as they are now styled, of Astrakhan and Kazan, and the troops which he detached towards Mount Caucasus explored the most secret recesses of Georgia and Circassia. The civil discord of the great dukes or princes of Russia betrayed their country to the Tartars. They spread from Livonia to the Black Sea, and both Moscow and Kiev, the modern and the ancient capitals, were reduced to ashes. A temporary ruin, less fatal than the deep and perhaps indelible mark which a servitude of 200 years has imprinted on the character of the Russians. The Tartars ravaged with equal fury the countries which they hoped to possess and those which they were hastening to leave. From the permanent conquest of Russia they made a deadly, though transient, inroad into the heart of Poland, and as far as the borders of Germany. The cities of Lublin and Cracow were obliterated. They approached the shores of the Baltic, and in the battle of Liegnitz they defeated the Dukes of Silesia, the Polish Palatines, and the great master of the Teutonic Order, and filled 9 sacks with the right ears of the slain. From Liegnitz, the extreme point of their western march, they turned aside to the invasion of Hungary, and the presence or spirit of Batu inspired the host of 500,000 men. The Carpathian hills could not be long impervious to their divided columns, and their approach had been fondly disbelieved till it was irresistibly felt. The king, Bela IV, assembled the military force of his counts and bishops, but he had alienated the nation by adopting a vagrant horde of 40,000 families of Comans, and these savage guests were provoked to revolt by the suspicion of treachery and the murder of their prince. The whole country north of the Danube was lost in a day, and depopulated in a summer, and the ruins of cities and churches were overspread with the bones of the natives, who expiated the sins of their Turkish ancestors. An ecclesiastic, who fled from the sack of Varadin, describes the calamities which he had seen or suffered, and the sanguinary rage of sieges and battles is far less atrocious than the treatment of the fugitives who had been allured from the woods under a promise of peace and pardon, and who were coolly slaughtered as soon as they had performed the labours of the harvest and vintage. In the winter the Tartars passed the Danube on the ice, and advanced to Gran or Strigonium, a German colony, and the metropolis of the kingdom. 30 engines were planted against the walls, the ditches were filled with sacks of earth and dead bodies, and after promiscuous massacre 300 noble matrons were slain in the presence of the Khan. Of all the cities and fortresses of Hungary, 3 alone survived the Tartar invasion, and the unfortunate Bata hid his head among the islands of the Adriatic. The Latin world was darkened by this cloud of savage hostility. A Russian fugitive carried the alarm to Sweden, and the remote nations of the Baltic and the ocean trembled at the approach of the Tartars, whom their fear and ignorance were inclined to separate from the human species. Since the invasion of the Arabs in the 8th century, Europe had never been exposed to a similar calamity, and if the disciples of Mohammed would have oppressed her religion and liberty, it might be apprehended that the shepherds of Scythia would extinguish her cities, her arts, and all the institutions of civil society. The Roman pontiff attempted to appease and convert these invincible pagans by a mission of Franciscan and Dominican friars, but he was astonished by the reply of the Khan, that the sons of God and of Zingis were invested with a divine power to subdue or extirpate the nations, and that the Pope would be involved in the universal destruction unless he visited in person and as a suppliant the royal horde. The Emperor, Frederick II, embraced a more generous mode of defence, and his letters to the kings of France and England and the princes of Germany represented the common danger and urged them to arm their vassals in this just and rational crusade. The Tartars themselves were awed by the fame and valor of the Franks. The town of Neustadt in Austria was bravely defended against them by 50 knights and 20 crossbows, and they raised the siege on the appearance of a German army. After wasting the adjacent kingdoms of Servia, Bosnia, and Bulgaria, Batu slowly retreated from the Danube to the Volga to enjoy the rewards of victory in the city and palace of Sarai, which started at his command from the midst of the desert. 4. Even the poor and frozen regions of the north attracted the arms of the Moguls. Shaibani Khan, the brother of the great Batu, led a horde of 15,000 families into the wilds of Siberia, and his descendants reigned at Tobolskoy above 3 centuries, till the Russian conquest. The spirit of enterprise which pursued the course of the Obi and Yenisei must have led to the discovery of the icy sea. After brushing away the monstrous fables of men with dogs' heads and cloven feet, we shall find that, 15 years after the death of Zingis, the Moguls were informed of the name and manners of the Samoyedes in the neighbourhood of the Polar Circle, who dwelled in subterraneous huts and derived their furs and their food from the sole occupation of hunting. End of chapter 64, part 2.
Part 3 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Vera Unreal. Chapter 64. Mongols, Ottoman Turks, Part 3. In this shipwreck of nations, some surprise may be excited by the escape of the Roman Empire, whose relics, at the time of the Mongol invasion, were dismembered by the Greeks and Latins. Less potent than Alexander, they were pressed, like the Macedonian, both in Europe and Asia, by the shepherds of Scythia. And had the Tartars undertaken the siege, Constantinople must have yielded to the fate of Pekin, Samarkand, and Baghdad. The glorious and voluntary retreat of Batu from the Danube was insulted by the vain triumph of the Franks and Greeks, and in a second expedition death surprised him in full march to attack the capital of the Caesars. His brother Bolga carried the Tartar arms into Bulgaria and Thrace, but he was diverted from the Byzantine war by a visit to Novgorod in the 57th degree of latitude, where he numbered the inhabitants and regulated the tributes of Russia. The Mongol Khan formed an alliance with the Mamelukes against his brethren of Persia. 300,000 horse penetrated through the gates of Derbent, and the Greeks might rejoice in the first example of domestic war. After the recovery of Constantinople, Michael Palaiologos, at a distance from his court and army, in the Thracian castle, by 20,000 Tartars. But the object of their march was a private interest. They came to the deliverance of Azzadin, the Turkish Sultan, and were content with his person and the treasure of the emperor. Their general Noga, whose name is perpetuated in the halls of Astrakhan, raised a formidable rebellion against Mengo Timur, the third of the Khans of Kipzak, obtained in marriage Maria, the natural daughter of Palaiologos, and guarded the dominions of his friend and father. The subsequent invasions of a Scythian caste were those of outlaws and fugitives, and some thousands of Alani and Comans, who had been driven from their native seat, were reclaimed from a vagrant life, and enlisted in the service of the empire. Such was the influence in Europe of the invasion of the Mongols, the first terror of their arms secured, rather than disturb, the peace of the Roman Asia. The Sultan of Iconium solicited a personal interview with John Vardakis, and his artful policy encouraged the Turks to defend their barrier against a common enemy. That barrier indeed was soon overthrown, and the servitude and ruin of the Seljukians exposed the nakedness of the Greeks. the formidable Holagou threatened to march to Constantinople at the head of 400,000 men, and the groundless panic of the citizens of Nice will present an image of the terror which he had inspired. The accident of a procession, and the sound of the doleful litany, from the fury of the Tartars, good Lord deliver us, had scattered the hasty report of an assault and massacre. In the blind credulity of fear, the streets of Nice were crowded with thousands of both sexes, who knew not from what or to whom they fled, and some hours elapsed before the firmness of the military officers could relieve the city from this imaginary foe. But the ambition of Holagou and his successors was fortunately diverted by the conquest of Baghdad and a long vicissitude of Syrian wars. Their hostility to the Moslems inclined them to unite with the Greeks and Franks, and their generosity or contempt had offered the kingdom of Anatolia as a reward of an Armenian vassal. The fragments of the Seljukian monarchy were disputed by the emirs who had occupied the cities or the mountains, but they all confessed the supremacy of the Khans of Persia, and he often interposed his authority, and sometimes his arms, to check their depredations, and to preserve the peace and balance of his Turkish frontier. The death of Kazan, one of the greatest and most accomplished princes of the house of Tingis, removed this salutary control, and the decline of the Mongols gave a free scope to the rise and progress of the Ottoman Empire. Footnote 34. Some reports of the Mongols in Hungary might propagate and colour the report of the union and victory of the kings of the Franks on the confines of Bulgaria. Abulpharagius, after 40 years, beyond the Tigris, might be easily deceived. Footnote 35. See Pachymel and the false alarm at Nice. Footnote 36. Acropolita. Footnote 37. Abulpharagius wrote in the year 1284, declares that the Mongols, since the fabulous defeat of Batu, had not attacked either the Franks or Greeks. And of this he is a competent witness. Hayton likewise, the Armenian prince, celebrates their friendship for himself and his nation. Footnote 38. Pachymel gives a splendid character of Kazan Khan, the rival of Cyrus and Alexander. In the conclusion of his history, he hopes much from the arrival of 30,000 Tokhars, or Tartars, who were ordered by the successor of Kazan to restrain the Turks of Bithynia. Footnote 39. The origin of the Ottoman dynasty is illustrated by the critical learning of Madame de Green and Danville, two inhabitants of Paris, from whom the Orientals may learn the history and geography of their own country. No, they may be still more enlightened by the Geschichte des Osmanreiches by M. von Hammer-Burgstall of Vienna. After the retreat of Tingis, the Sultan Jalaluddin of Khwarezmi had returned from India to the possession and defense of his Persian kingdoms. In the space of 11 years, then hero fought in person 14 battles, and such was his activity that he led his cavalry in 17 days from Selfis to Kerman, a march of 1,000 miles. Yet he was oppressed by the jealousy of the Moslem princes and the innumerable armies of the Mongols, and after his last defeat, Jalaluddin perished ignobly in the mountains of Kurdistan. His death dissolved a veteran and adventurous army, which included under the name of Khwarezmians or Khwarezmins many Turkmen hordes that had attached themselves to the Sultan's fortune. The bolder and more powerful chiefs invaded Syria and violated the holy sepulchre of Jerusalem. The more humble engaged in the service of Aladdin, Sultan of Iconium, and among these were the obscure fathers of the Ottoman line. They had formerly pitched their tents near the southern banks of the Oxus, in the plains of Mahan and Nisa, and it is somewhat remarkable that the same spot should have produced the first authors of the Parthian and Turkish empires. At the head or in the rear of a Kharizmian army. Suleiman Shah was drowned in the passage of the Euphrates. His son Orthogrul became the soldier and subject of Aladdin, and established at Surgut, on the banks of the Samar, a camp of 400 families or tens, whom he governed 52 years both in peace and war. He was the father of Tharman or Othman, whose Turkish name has been melted into the appellation of the Caliph Othman. And if we describe that pastoral chief as a shepherd and a robber, we must separate from those characters all idea of ignominy and baseness. Othman possessed, and perhaps surpassed, the ordinary virtues of a soldier, and the circumstances of time and place were propitious to his independence and success. The Seljukian dynasty was no more, and the distance and decline of the Mongol Khans soon enfranchised him from the control of a superior. He was situated on the verge of the Greek Empire. The Koran sanctified his Ghazi or holy war against the infidels, and their political errors unlocked the passes of Mount Olympus, and invited him to descend into the plains of Bithynia. Till the reign of Palaeologus, these passes had been vigilantly guarded by the militia of the country, who were paid by their own safety and an exemption from taxes. The emperor abolished their privilege, and assumed the office, but the tribute was rigorously collected, the custody of the passes was neglected, and the hardy mountaineers degenerated into a trembling crowd of peasants without spirit or discipline. It was on the 27th of July, in the year 1299 of the Christian era, that Othman first invaded the territory of Nicomedia, and the singular accuracy of the date seems to disclose some foresight of the rapid and destructive growth of the monster. The annals of the 27 years of his reign will exhibit a repetition of the same inroads, and his hereditary troops were multiplied in each campaign by the accession of captives and volunteers. Instead of retreating to the hills, he maintained the most useful and defensive posts, fortified the towns and castles which he had first pillaged, and renounced the pastoral life for the baths and palaces of his infant capitals. But it was not till Othman was oppressed by age and infirmities that he received the welcome news of the conquest of Prusa, which had been surrendered by famine or treachery to the arms of his son Orchan. The glory of Othman is chiefly founded on that of his descendants, but the Turks have transcribed or composed a royal testament of his last counsels of justice and moderation. Footnote 40. See Pegama, and concerning the god of the mountains, Nicephorus Gregoras, in the first book of Launicus Chalcondyles, the Athenian. Footnote 41. I am ignorant whether the Turks have any writers older than Mahomet II, nor can I reach beyond a meagre chronicle. Annales Turcici ad Annum, translated by John Gaudier, and published by Leon Clavius, ad Galgem Launic Galgont, with copious Pandects or commentaries. The history of the growth and decay of the Ottoman Empire was translated into English from the Latin MS of Demetrius Cantemir, Prince of Moldavia. The author is guilty of strange blunders in Oriental history, but he was conversant with the language, the annals, and institutions of the Turks. Cantemir partly draws his materials from the synopsis of Sa'adi, Effendi of Larissa, dedicated in the year 1696 to Sultan Mustafa, and a valuable abridgment of the original historians. In one of the Ramblers, Dr. Johnson praises Knowles, a general history of the Turks to the present year, as the first of historians, unhappy only in the choice of his subjects. Yet I much doubt whether a partial and verbose compilation from Latin writers, 1300 folio pages of speeches and battles, can either instruct or amuse an enlightened age, which requires from the historian some tincture of philosophy and criticism. No, we could have wished that M. von Hammer had given a more clear and distinct reply to this question of Gibbon. In a note Von Hammer shows that they had not only Sikhs, religious writers, and then lawyers, but poets and authors on medicine. But the inquiry of Gibbon obviously refers to historians. The oldest of the historical works of which von Hammer makes use is the Tarikhi Ashik Pasha, that is, the history of the great-grandson of Ashik Pasha, who was a dervish and celebrated ascetic poet in the reign of Murad I. Ahmad, the author of the work, lived during the reign of Bajazet II, but he says derived much information from the book of Sheikh Jaqsi, the son of Ilyas, who was Imam to Sultan Orchan, and who related, from the lips of his father, the circumstances of the earliest Ottoman history. This book, having searched for it in vain for 25 years, our author found at length the Vatican. All the other Turkish histories on his list, as indeed this, were written during the reign of Mohammed II. It does not appear whether any of the rest cite the authorities of equal value with that claimed by the Tarikhi Ashik Pasha. From the conquest of Prussia, you may date the true era of the Ottoman Empire. The lives and possessions of the Christian subjects were redeemed by a tribute or ransom of 30,000 crowns of gold, and the city, by the labours of Orchan, assumed the aspect of a Mahometan capital. Prussia was decorated with a mosque, a college, and a hospital of royal foundation. The Seljukian coin was changed for the name and impression of the new dynasty, and the most skilful professors of human and divine knowledge attracted the Persian and Arabian students from the ancient schools of Oriental learning. The office of a vizier was instituted for Aladdin, the brother of Orchan, and a different habit distinguished the citizens from the peasants, the Muslims from the infidels. All the troops of Othman had consisted of loose squadrons of Turkmen cavalry, who served without pay and fought without discipline. But a regular body of infantry was established and trained by the prudence of his son. A great number of volunteers was enrolled with a small stipend, but with the permission of living at home, unless they were summoned to the field. The rude manners and seditious temper disposed Orchan to educate his young captives as his soldiers and those of the Prophet, but the Turkish peasants were still allowed to mount on horseback and follow his standard, with the appellation and the hopes of freebooters. By these arts he formed an army of 25,000 Moslems. A train of battering engines was framed for the use of sieges, and the first successful experiment was made on the cities of Nice and Nicomedia. Orchan granted a safe conduct to all who were desirous of departing with their families and effects. But the widows of the slain were given in marriage to the conquerors, and the sacrilegious plunder, the books, the vases, and the images, were sold a ransom at Constantinople. The Emperor Andronicus the Younger was vanquished and plundered by the son of Othman. He subdued the whole province or kingdom of Bithynia, as far as the shores of the Bosphorus and Hellespont, and the Christians confessed the justice and clemency of a reign which claimed the voluntary attachment of the Turks of Asia. Yet Orchan was content with the modest title of Emir, and in the list of his compeers, the princes of Rome or Anatolia, his military forces were surpassed by the emirs of Gamian and Karamania, each of whom could bring into the field an army of 40,000 men. Their domains were situated in the heart of the Seljukian kingdom, but the holy warriors, though of inferior note, who formed new principalities on the Greek Empire, are more conspicuous in the light of history. The maritime country from the Propontis to Mayanda, and the Isle of Rhodes, so long threatened and so often pillaged, was finally lost about the 13th year of Andronicus the Elder. Two Turkish chieftains, Sarukhan and Aydin, left their names to their conquests, and their conquests to their posterity. The captivity of Rued and the 7 churches of Asia was consummated, and the barbarous lords of Ionia and Lydia still trample on the monuments of classic and Christian antiquity. In the loss of Ephesus, the Christians deplored the fall of the first angel, the extinction of the first candlestick of the Revelations. The desolation is complete, and the temple of Diana, or the church of Mary, will equally elude the search of the curious traveller. The circus and three stately theatres of Laodicea are now peopled with wolves and foxes. Sardis is reduced to a miserable village. The god of Mahomet, without a rival or a son, is invoked in the mosques of Thyatira and Pergamus, and the populousness of Smyrna is supported by the foreign trade of Franks and Armenians. Philadelphia alone has been saved by prophecy or courage. At a distance from the sea, forgotten by the empress, and encompassed on all sides by the Turks, her valiant citizens defended their religion and freedom above fourscore years, and at length capitulated with the proudest of the Ottomans. Among the Greek colonies and churches of Asia, Philadelphia is still erect, a column in a scene of ruins, a pleasing example that the paths of honor and safety may sometimes be the same. The servitude of Rhodes was delayed about 2 centuries by the establishment of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. Under the discipline of order, the island emerged into fame and opulence. The noble and warlike monks were renowned by land and sea, and the bulwark of Christendom provoked and repelled the arms of the Turks and Saracens. Footnote 42. Cantacuzene, though he relates the battle and heroic fight of the younger Andronicus, dissembles by his silence the loss of Prusa, Nice, and Nicomedia, which are fairly confessed by Nicephorus Gregoras. It appears that Nice was taken by Orchan in 1330, and Nicomedia in 1339, which is somewhat different from the Turkish dates. Footnote 43. The partition of the Turkish emirs is extracted from 2 contemporaries, the Greek Nicephorus Gregoras and the Arabian Marrakeshi. See likewise the first book of Laonicus Galgondules. Footnote 44. Bakimir. Footnote 45. See the travels of Rila and Spon, of Pocock and Chandler, and more particularly Smith's survey of the 7 churches of Asia. The more pious antiquaries labour to reconcile the promises and threats of the author of the Revelations with the present state of 7 cities. Perhaps it would be more prudent to confine his predictions to the characters and events of his own times. Footnote 46. Consult the 4th book of the Histoire de l'Ordre de Malte, par l'Abbé de Vertou. That pleasing writer betrays his ignorance in supposing that Othman, a freebooter of the Bithynian hills, could besiege Rhodes by sea and land. The Greeks, by their intestine divisions, were the authors of the final ruin. During the civil wars of the elder and younger Andronicus, the son of Othman achieved, almost without resistance, the conquest of Bithynia, and the same disorders encouraged the Turkish emirs of Lydia and Ionia to build a fleet, and to pillage the adjacent islands and the seacoast of Europe. In the defense of his life and honor, Cantacuzene was tempted to prevent or imitate his adversaries by calling to aid the public enemies of his region and country. Amir, the son of Aidin, concealed under a Turkish garb the humanity and politeness of a Greek. He was united with the great domestic by mutual esteem and reciprocal services, and their friendship is compared, in the vain rhetoric of the times, to the perfect union of Orestes and Pylades. On the report of the danger of his friend, who was persecuted by an ungrateful court, the Prince of Ionia assembled at Smyrna a fleet of 300 vessels, with an army of 29,000 men, sailed in the depth of winter, and cast anchor at the mouth of the Hebrus. From thence, with a chosen band of 2,000 Turks, he marched along the banks of the river, and rescued the empress was besieged in Demotica by the wild barbarians. At that disastrous moment, the life or death of his beloved Cantacuzene was concealed by his flight into Servia. But that grateful Irene, impatient to behold her deliverer, invited him to enter the city, and accompanied her message with a present of rich apparel and 100 horses. By a peculiar strain of delicacy, the gentle barbarian refused, in the absence of an unfortunate friend, to visit his wife, or to taste the luxuries of the palace, sustained in his den the rigour of winter, and rejected the hospitable gift, that he might share the hardships of 2,000 companions, all as deserving as himself that of honour and distinction. Necessity and revenge might justify his predatory excursions by sea and land. He left 9,500 men for the guard of his fleet, and persevered in the fruitless search of Cantacuzene. This embarkation was hastened by a fictitious letter, the severity of the season, the clamours of his independent troops, and the weight of his spoil and captives. In the prosecution of the civil war, the Prince of Ionia twice returned to Europe, joined his arms with those of the Emperor, besieged Thessalonica, and threatened Constantinople. Calumny might affix some reproach on his imperfect late, hasty departure, and a bribe of 10,000 crowns, which he accepted from the Byzantine court. But his friend was satisfied, and the conduct of Armia is excused by the more sacred duty of defending against the Latins his hereditary dominions. The maritime power of the Turks had united the Pope, the King of Cyprus, the Republic of Venice, and the Order of St. John in a laudable crusade. Their galleys invaded the coast of Ionia, and Amir was slain with an arrow, in the attempt to wrest from the Rhodian knights the citadel of Smyrna. Before his death, he generously recommended an ally of his own nation, not more sincere or zealous than himself, but more able to afford a prompt and powerful succor. By his situation along the Propontis and in the front of Constantinople, by the prospect of a more advantageous treaty, the Turkish prince of Bithynia was detached from his engagements with Anne of Savoy, and the pride of fortune dictated the most solemn protestations that if he could obtain the daughter of Cantacuzene, he would invariably fulfil the duties of a subject and a son. Parental tenderness was silenced by the voice of ambition. The Greek clergy connived at the marriage of a Christian princess with a sectary of Mahomet, and the father of Theodora describes, with shameful satisfaction, the dishonour of the purple. A body of Turkish cavalry attended the ambassadors, who disembarked from 30 vessels before his camp of Seleucia. A stately pavilion was erected, in which the Empress Irene passed the night with her daughters. In the morning, Theodora ascended a throne, which was surrounded with curtains of silk and gold. The troops were under arms, but the emperor alone was on horseback. At a signal, the curtains were suddenly withdrawn to disclose the bride or the victim, encircled by kneeling eunuchs and hymeneal torches. The sound of flutes and trumpets proclaimed the joyful event, and her pretended happiness was the theme of the nuptial song, which was chanted by such poets as the age could produce. Without the rites of the church, Theodora was delivered to her barbarous lot, but it had been stipulated that she should preserve her religion in the harem of Bursa, and her father celebrates her charity and devotion in this ambiguous situation. After his peaceful establishment on the throne of Constantinople, the Greek emperor visited his Turkish ally, who with 4 sons by various wives expected him at Scutari on the Asiatic shore. The 2 princes parted with seeming cordiality of the pleasures of banquet and the chase, and Theodora was permitted to repass the Bosphorus and to enjoy some days in the society of her mother. But the friendship of Orchan was subservient to his religion and interest, and in the Genoese war he joined without a blush the enemies of Cantacuzene. Footnote 46. Nicephorus Gregoras has expatiated with pleasure on this amiable character. Cantacuzene speaks with honour and esteem of his ally, but he seems ignorant of his own sentimental passion for the Turks, and indirectly denies the possibility of such a natural friendship. Footnote 48. After the conquest of Smyrna by the Latins, the defence of this fortress was imposed by Pope Gregory XI on the Knights of Rhodes. Footnote 49. See Cantacuzenus, Nicephorus Gregoras, who, for the like of Mount Thabor, brands the emperor with the names of tyrant and herald, excuses rather than blames this Turkish marriage, and alleges the passion and power of Orchan, Encutanuve, cae Dunamu, tu datatum de persicum uperawin sapatrav. He afterwards celebrates his kingdom and armies. Sees reign in Cantemir. In the treaty with the Empress Anne, the Ottoman prince had inserted a singular condition that it should be lawful for him to sell his prisoners at Constantinople, or transport them to Asia, a naked crowd of Christians of both sexes and every age, of priests and monks, of matrons and virgins, was exposed in the public market. The whip was frequently used to quicken the charity of redemption, and the indigent Greeks deplored the fate of their brethren, who were led away to worse evils of temporal and spiritual bondage, which Cantacuzene was reduced to subscribe the same terms, and their execution must have been still more pernicious to the empire. A body of 10,000 Turks had been detached to the assistance of the Empress Anne, but the entire forces of Orchan were exerted in service of his father. Yet these calamities were of a transient nature. As soon as the storm had passed away, the fugitives might return to their habitations, and at the conclusion of the civil and foreign wars, Europe was completely evacuated by the Moslems of Asia. It was in this last quarrel with his pupil that Cantacuzene inflicted the deep and deadly wound, which could never be healed by his successors, and which is poorly expiated by his theological dialogues against the Prophet Mahomet. Ignorant of their own history, the modern Turks confound their first and final passage of the Hellespont, and describe the son of Orchan as a nocturnal robber, who, with 80 companions, explores by stratagem a hostile and unknown shore. Soliman, at the head of 10,000 horse, was transported in the vessels, and entertained as a friend of the Greek emperor. In the civil wars of Romania, he performed some service and perpetrated more mischief. But Chersonesus was insensibly filled with a Turkish colony, and the Byzantine court solicited in vain the restitution of the fortress of Thrace. After some artful delays between the Ottoman prince and his son, the ransom was valued at 60,000 crowns, and the first payment had been made when an earthquake shook the walls and cities of the provinces. The dismantled places were occupied by the Turks, and Gallipoli, the key of the Hellespont, was rebuilt and repeopled by the policy of Soliman. The abdication of Cantacuzene dissolved the feeble bands of domestic alliances, and his last advice admonished his countrymen to decline the rash contests, and compare their own weakness with the numbers and valor, the discipline and enthusiasm of the Moslems. His prudent counsels were despised by the headstrong vanity of youth, and soon justified by the victories of the Ottomans. But as he practised in the field the exercise of a chariot, Soliman was killed by a fall from his horse, and the aged Orchan wept and expired on the tomb of his valiant son. Footnote 50. The most lively and concise picture of his captivity may be found in the history of Ducas, who fairly describes what Cantacuzene confesses with a guilty blush. Footnote 51. In this passage, and the first conquest in Europe, Cantemir gives a miserable idea of its Turkish gods, Nor am I much better satisfied with Chalcondyles. They forget to consult the most authentic record, and the fourth book of Cantacuzene. I likewise regret the last books, which are still manuscript, of Nicephorus Gregoras. No, von Hammer excuses the silence with which the Turkish historians pass over the earlier intercourse of the Ottomans with the European continent, of which he enumerates 16 different occasions, as if they disdained those peaceful incursions by which they gained no conquest, and established no permanent footing on the Byzantine territory. Of the romantic account of Soliman's first expedition, he says, as yet the prose of history had not asserted its right over the poetry of tradition. This defence would scarcely be accepted as satisfactory by the historian of the decline and fall. End of chapter 64, part 3.
Part 4 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6 by Edward Gibbon, Chapter 14, Part 4. But the Greeks had not time to rejoice in the death of their enemies, and the Turkish scimitar was wielded with the same spirit by Amurath I, the son of Orkhan and the brother of Solomon. By the pale and fainting light of the Byzantine annals, we can discern that he subdued without resistance the whole province of Romania or Thrace, from the Hellespont to Mount Haemus, and the verge of the capital, and that Adrianople was chosen for the royal seat of his government and religion in Europe. Constantinople, whose decline is almost coeval with her foundation, had often, in the lapse of 1,000 years, been assaulted by the barbarians of the east and west. But never till this fatal hour had the Greeks been surrounded, both in Asia and Europe, by the arms of the same hostile monarchy. Yet the prudence or generosity of Amurath postponed for a while this easy conquest, and his pride was satisfied with the frequent and humble attendance of the Emperor John Palaeologus and his 4 sons, who followed at his summons the court and camp of the Ottoman prince. He marched against the Slavonian nations between the Danube and the Adriatic, the Bulgarians, Servians, Bosnians, and Albanians, and these warlike tribes, who had so often insulted the majesty of the empire, were repeatedly broken by his destructive inroads. Their countries did not abound either in gold or silver, nor were their rustic hamlets and townships enriched by commerce or decorated by the arts of luxury. But the natives of the soil have been distinguished in every age by their hardiness of mind and body, and they were converted by a prudent institution into the firmest and most faithful supporters of the Ottoman greatness. The vizier of Amurath reminded his sovereign that, according to the Mahometan law, he was entitled to a 5th part of the spoil and captives, and that the duty might easily be levied if vigilant officers were stationed in Gallipoli to watch the passage, and to select for his use the stoutest and most beautiful of the Christian youth. The advice was followed, the edict was proclaimed, many thousands of the European captives were educated in religion and arms, and the new militia was consecrated and named by a celebrated dervis. Standing in the front of their ranks, he stretched the sleeve of his gown over the head of the foremost soldier, and his blessing was delivered in these words: "Let them be called Janissaries, Yengi Teri, or new soldiers. May their countenance be ever bright, their hand victorious, their sword keen. May their spear always hang over the heads of their enemies, and wheresoever they go, may they return with a white face." Such was the origin of these haughty troops, the terror of the nations, and sometimes of the sultans themselves. Their valour has declined, their discipline is relaxed, and their tumultuary array is incapable of contending with the order and weapon of modern tactics. But at the time of their institution they possessed a decisive superiority in war, since a regular body of infantry, in constant exercise and pay, was not maintained by any of the princes of Christendom. The Janissaries fought with the zeal of proselytes against their idolatrous countrymen, and in the battle of Kosovo, the league and independence of the Sclavonian tribes was finally crushed. As the conqueror walked over the field, he observed that the greatest part of the slain consisted of beardless youths, and listened to the flattering reply of his vizier that age and wisdom would have taught them not to oppose his irresistible arms. But the sword of the Janissaries could not defend him from the dagger of despair. A Servian soldier started from the crowd of dead bodies, and Amurath was pierced in the belly with a mortal wound. The grandson of Othman was mild in his temper, modest in his apparel, and a lover of learning and virtue, but the Moslems were scandalized by his absence from public worship, and he was corrected by the firmness of the Mufti, who dared to reject his testimony in a civil cause, a mixture of servitude and freedom not unfrequent in Oriental history. The character of Bajazet, the son and successor of Amurath, is strongly expressed in his surname of Ilderim, or the Lightning, and he might glory in an epithet which was drawn from the fiery energy of his soul and the rapidity of his destructive march. In the 14 years of his reign, he incessantly moved at the head of his armies, from Bursa to Adrianople, from the Danube to the Euphrates, and though he strenuously laboured for the propagation of the law, he invaded, with impartial ambition, the Christian and Mahometan princes of Europe and Asia. From Angora to Amasia and Erzerum, the northern regions of Anatolia were reduced to his obedience. He stripped of their hereditary possessions his brother emirs of Germian and Caramania, of Aden and Sarucan, and after the conquest of Iconium, the ancient kingdom of the Seljukians again revived in the Ottoman dynasty. Nor were the conquests of Bajazet less rapid or important in Europe. No sooner had he imposed a regular form of servitude on the Servians and Bulgarians, than he passed the Danube to seek new enemies and new subjects in the heart of Moldavia. Whatever yet adhered to the Greek empire in Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly acknowledged a Turkish master. An obsequious bishop led him through the gates of Thermopylae into Greece, and we may observe, as a singular fact, that the widow of a Spanish chief, who possessed the ancient seat of the oracle of Delphi, deserved his favour by the sacrifice of a beauteous daughter. The Turkish communications between Europe and Asia had been dangerous and doubtful, till he stationed at Gallipoli a fleet of galleys, to command the Hellespont and intercept the Latin succours of Constantinople. While the monarch indulged his passions in a boundless range of injustice and cruelty, he imposed on his soldiers the most rigid laws of modesty and abstinence, and the harvest was peaceably reaped and sold within the precincts of his camp. Provoked by the loose and corrupt administration of justice, he collected in a house the judges and lawyers of his dominions, who expected that in a few moments the fire would be kindled to reduce them to ashes. His ministers trembled in silence, but an Ethiopian buffoon presumed to insinuate the true cause of the evil, and future venality was left without excuse, by annexing an adequate salary to the office of Cadi. The humble title of Emir was no longer suitable to the Ottoman greatness, and Bajazet condescended to accept a patent of Sultan from the Caliphs who served in Egypt under the yokes of the Mamelukes. A last and frivolous homage that was yielded by force to opinion, by the Turkish conquerors to the house of Abbas and the successors of the Arabian prophet. The ambition of the Sultan was inflamed by the obligation of deserving this august title. He turned his arms against the kingdom of Hungary, the perpetual theatre of the Turkish victories and defeats. Sigismund, the Hungarian king, was the son and brother of the emperors of the West. His cause was that of Europe and the Church, and on the report of his danger, the bravest knights of France and Germany were eager to march under his standard and that of the cross. In the battle of Nicopolis, Bajazet defeated a confederate army of 100,000 Christians, who had proudly boasted that if the sky should fall they could uphold it on their lances. The far greater part were slain or driven into the Danube, and Sigismund, escaping to Constantinople by the river and the Black Sea, returned after a long circuit to his exhausted kingdom. In the pride of victory, Bajazet threatened that he would besiege Buda, that he would subdue the ancient countries of Germany and Italy, and that he would feed his horse with a bushel of oats on the altar of St. Peter at Rome. His progress was checked, not by the miraculous interposition of the apostle, not by a crusade of the Christian powers, but by a long and painful fit of the gout. The disorders of the moral are sometimes corrected by those of the physical world, and an acrimonious humour falling on a single fibre of one man may prevent or suspend the misery of nations. Such is the general idea of the Hungarian war, but the disastrous adventure of the French has procured us the memorials which illustrate the victory and character of Bajazet. The Duke of Burgundy, sovereign of Flanders and uncle of Charles VI, yielded to the ardour of his son, John, Count of Nevers, and the fearless youth was accompanied by 4 princes, his cousins, and those of the French monarch. Their inexperience was guided by the Sire de Coucy, one of the best and oldest captains of Christendom. But the Constable, Admiral, and Marshal of France commanded an army which did not exceed the number of 1,000 knights and squires. These splendid names were the source of presumption and the bane of discipline. So many might aspire to command that none were willing to obey. Their national spirit despised both their enemies and their allies, and in the persuasion that Bajazet would fly, or must fall, they began to compute how soon they should visit Constantinople and deliver the Holy Sepulchre. When their scouts announced the approach of the Turks, the gay and thoughtless youths were at table, already heated with wine. They instantly clasped their armour, mounted their horses, rose full speed to the vanguard, and resented as an affront the advice of Sigismund, which would have deprived them of the right and honour of the foremost attack. The battle of Nicopolis would not have been lost if the French would have obeyed the prudence of the Hungarians. But it might have been gloriously won had the Hungarians imitated the valour of the French. They dispersed the first line, consisting of the troops of Asia, forced a rampart of stakes which had been planted against the cavalry, broke, after a bloody conflict, the Janissaries themselves, and were at length overwhelmed by the numerous squadrons that issued from the woods and charged on all sides this handful of intrepid warriors. In the speed and secrecy of his march, in the order and evolutions of the battle, his enemies felt and admired the military talents of Bajazet. They accuse his cruelty in the use of victory. After reserving the Count of Nevers and 24 lords, whose birth and riches were attested by his Latin interpreters, the remainder of the French captives, who had survived the slaughter of the day, were led before his throne, and as they refused to abjure their faith, were successively beheaded in his presence. The Sultan was exasperated by the loss of his bravest Janissaries, and if it be true that, on the eve of the engagement, the French had massacred their Turkish prisoners, they might impute to themselves the consequences of a just retaliation. A knight whose life had been spared was permitted to return to Paris that he might relate the deplorable tale, and solicit the ransom of the noble captives. In the meanwhile, the Count of Nevers, with the princes and barons of France, were dragged along in the marches of the Turkish camp, exposed as a grateful trophy to the Moslems of Europe and Asia, and strictly confined at Bursa as often as Bajazet resided in his capital. The Sultan was pressed each day to expiate with their blood the blood of his martyrs, but he had pronounced that they should live, and either for mercy or destruction his word was irrevocable. He was assured of their value and importance by the return of the messenger and the gifts and intercessions of the kings of France and Cyprus. Lusignan presented him with a gold salt cellar of curious workmanship, and of the price of 10,000 ducats, and Charles VI dispatched by the way of Hungary a cast of Norwegian hawks, and 6 horseloads of scarlet cloth, of fine linen of Rheims, and of Arras tapestry, representing the battles of the great Alexander. After much delay, the effect of distance rather than of art, Bajazet agreed to accept a ransom of 200,000 ducats for the Count of Nevers and the surviving princes and barons. The Marshal Boucicaut, a famous warrior, was of the number of the fortunate, but the Admiral of France had been slain in battle, and the Constable, with the Sire de Coucy, died in the prison of Bursa. This heavy demand, which was doubled by incidental costs, fell chiefly on the Duke of Burgundy, or rather on his Flemish subjects, who were bound by the feudal laws to contribute for the knighthood and captivity of the eldest son of their lord. For the faithful discharge of the debt, some merchants of Genoa gave security to the amount of 5 times the sum, a lesson to those warlike times, that commerce and credit are the links of the society of nations. It had been stipulated in the treaty that the French captives should swear never to bear arms against the person of their conqueror, but the ungenerous restraint was abolished by Bajazet himself. "I despise," said he to the heir of Burgundy, "thy oaths and thy arms. Thou art young, and mayst be ambitious of effacing the disgrace or misfortune of thy first chivalry. Assemble thy powers, proclaim thy design, and be assured that Bajazet will rejoice to meet thee a second time in the field of battle." Before their departure, they were indulged in the freedom and hospitality of the court of Borsa. The French princes admired the magnificence of the Ottoman, whose hunting and hawking equipage was composed of 7,000 huntsmen and 7,000 falconers. In their presence, and at his command, the belly of one of his chamberlains was cut open, on a complaint against him for drinking the goat's milk of a poor woman. The strangers were astonished by this act of justice, but it was the justice of a sultan who disdains to balance the weight of evidence, or to measure the degrees of guilt. After his enfranchisement from an oppressive guardian, John Palaeologus remained 36 years, the helpless, and as it should seem, the careless, spectator of the public ruin. Love, or rather lust, was his only vigorous passion, and in the embraces of the wives and virgins of the city, the Turkish slave forgot the dishonour of the Emperor of the Romans Andronicus. His eldest son had formed at Adrianople an intimate and guilty friendship with Sauzes, the son of Amurath, and the two youths conspired against the authority and lives of their parents. The presence of Amurath in Europe soon discovered and dissipated their rash counsels, and after depriving Sauzes of his sight, the Ottoman threatened his vassal with the treatment of an accomplice and an enemy, unless he inflicted a similar punishment on his own son. Palaeologus trembled and obeyed, and a cruel precaution involved in the same sentence the childhood and innocence of John, the son of the criminal. But the operation was so mildly or so unskilfully performed, that the one retained the sight of an eye, and the other was inflicted only with the infirmity of squinting. Thus excluded from the succession, the two princes were confined in the tower of Anema, and the piety of Manuel, the second son of the reigning monarch, was rewarded with the gift of the imperial crown. But at the end of 2 years, the turbulence of the Latins and the levity of the Greeks produced a revolution, and the two emperors were buried in the tower from whence the two prisoners were exalted to the throne. Another period of 2 years afforded Palaeologus and Manuel the means of escape. It was contrived by the magic or subtlety of a monk, who was alternately named the Angel or the Devil. They fled to Scutari, their adherents armed in their cause, and the two Byzantine factions displayed the ambition and animosity with which Caesar and Pompey had disputed the empire of the world. The Roman world was now contracted to a corner of Thrace, between the Propontis and the Black Sea, about 50 miles in length and 30 in breadth, a space of ground not more extensive than the lesser principalities of Germany or Italy, if the remains of Constantinople had not still represented the wealth and populousness of a kingdom. To restore the public peace, it was found necessary to divide this fragment of the empire, and while Palaeologus and Manuel were left in possession of the capital, almost all that lay without the walls was ceded to the blind princes, who fixed their residences at Rodosto and Selybria. In the tranquil slumber of royalty, the passions of John Palaeologus survived his reason and his strength. He deprived his favourite and heir of a blooming princess of Trebizond, and while the feeble emperor laboured to consummate his nuptials, Manuel, with 100 of the noblest Greeks, was sent on a peremptory summons to the Ottoman Porte. They served with honour in the wars of Bajazet, but a plan of fortifying Constantinople excited his jealousy. He threatened their lives. The new works were instantly demolished, and we shall bestow a praise, perhaps above the merit of Palaeologus, if we impute this last humiliation as the cause of his death. The earliest intelligence of that event was communicated to Manuel, who escaped with speed and secrecy from the palace of Bursa to the Byzantine throne. Bajazet affected a proud indifference at the loss of this valuable pledge, and while he pursued his conquests in Europe and Asia, he left the emperor to struggle with his blind cousin John of Selybria, who in 8 years of civil war asserted his right of primogeniture. At length the ambition of the victorious sultan pointed to the conquest of Constantinople, but he listened to the advice of his vizier, who represented that such an enterprise might unite the powers of Christendom in a second and more formidable crusade. His epistle to the emperor was conceived in these words: "By the divine clemency, our invincible Scimitar has reduced to our obedience almost all Asia, with many and large countries in Europe, excepting only the city of Constantinople. For beyond the walls thou hast nothing left. Resign that city, stipulate thy reward, or tremble for thyself and thy unhappy people at the consequences of a rash refusal." But his ambassadors were instructed to soften their tone and to propose a treaty, which was subscribed with submission and gratitude. A truce of 10 years was purchased by an annual tribute of 30,000 crowns of gold. The Greeks deplored the public toleration of the law of Mahomet, and Bajazet enjoyed the glory of establishing a Turkish Cadi and founding a royal mosque in the metropolis of the Eastern Church. Yet this truce was soon violated by the restless Sultan. In the cause of the Prince of Selybria, the lawful emperor, an army of Ottomans again threatened Constantinople, and the distress of Manuel implored the protection of the King of France. His plaintive embassy obtained much pity and some relief, and the conduct of the succour was entrusted to the Marshal Boucicaut, whose religious chivalry was inflamed by the desire of revenging his captivity on the infidels. He sailed with 4 ships of war, from Aigues-Mortes to the Hellespont, forced the passage, which was guarded by 17 Turkish galleys, landed at Constantinople a supply of 600 men-at-arms and 1,600 archers, and reviewed them in the adjacent plain, without condescending to number or array the multitude of Greeks. By his presence the blockade was raised both by sea and land. The flying squadrons of Bajazet were driven to a more respectful distance, and several castles in Europe and Asia were stormed by the emperor and the marshal, who fought with equal valour by each other's side. But the Ottomans soon returned with an increase of numbers, and the intrepid Boucicaut, after a year's struggle, resolved to evacuate a country which could no longer afford either pay or provisions for his soldiers. The marshal offered to conduct Manuel to the French court, where he might solicit in person a supply of men and money, and advised in the meanwhile that to extinguish all domestic discord he should leave his blind competitor on the throne. The proposal was embraced. The Prince of Selybria was introduced to the capital, and such was the public misery that the lot of the exile seemed more fortunate than that of the sovereign. Instead of applauding the success of his vassal, the Turkish Sultan claimed the city as his own, and on the refusal of the Emperor John, Constantinople was more closely pressed by the calamities of war and famine. Against such an enemy, prayers and resistance were alike unavailing, and the savage would have devoured his prey if, in the fatal moment, he had not been overthrown by another savage stronger than himself. By the victory of Timur, or Tamerlane, the fall of Constantinople was delayed about 50 years, and this important though accidental service may justly introduce the life and character of the Mogul conqueror. End of chapter 14. End of chapter 14, part 4. Stop. End of chapter 14, part 4.
Chapter 65, Part 1 of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 6, Chapter 65, Part 1. Elevation of Timur, or Tamerlane, to the throne of Samarcand. His conquests in Persia, Georgia, Tartary, Russia, India, Syria, and Anatolia. His Turkish war. Defeat and captivity of Bajazet. Death of Timur. Civil war of the sons of Bajazet. Restoration of the Turkish monarchy by Muhammad I. Siege of Constantinople by Amurath II. The conquest and monarchy of the world was the first object of the ambition of Timur. To live in the memory and esteem of future ages was the second wish of his magnanimous spirit. All the civil and military transactions of his reign were diligently recorded in the journals of his secretaries. The authentic narrative was revised by the persons best informed of each particular transaction, and it is believed in the empire and family of Timur that the monarch himself composed the commentaries of his life and the institutions of his government. But these cares were ineffectual for the preservation of his fame, and these precious memorials in the Mogul or Persian language were concealed from the world, or at least from the knowledge of Europe. The nations which he vanquished exercised a base and impotent revenge, and ignorance has long repeated the tale of calumny which has disfigured the birth and character, the person, and even the name of Tamerlane. Yet his real merit would be enhanced rather than debased by the elevation of a peasant to the throne of Asia. Nor can lameness be a theme of reproach unless he had the weakness to blush at a natural or perhaps an honorable infirmity. In the eyes of the Moguls, who held the indefeasible succession of the house of Zingis, he was doubtless a rebel subject, yet he sprang from the noble tribe of Berlas. His fifth ancestor, Karashar Nevian, had been the vizier of Zagatai in his new realm of Transoxiana, and in the ascent of some generations the branch of Timur is confounded, at least by the females, with the imperial stem. He was born 40 miles to the south of Samarcand, in the village of Sebzar, in the fruitful territory of Kash, of which his fathers were the hereditary chiefs, as well as of a Toman of 10,000 horse. His birth was cast on one of those periods of anarchy which announce the fall of the Asiatic dynasties, and open a new field to adventurous ambition. The Khans of Zagatai were extinct, the emirs aspired to independence, and their domestic feuds can only be suspended by the conquest and tyranny of the Khans of Kashgar, who, with an army of Getis, or Kalmuks, invaded the Transoxian kingdom. From the 12th year of his age, Timur had entered the field of action. In the 25th, he stood forth as the deliverer of his country, and the eyes and wishes of the people were turned towards a hero who suffered in their cause. The chiefs of the law and of the army had pledged their salvation to support him with their lives and fortunes. But in the hour of danger they were silent and afraid, and after waiting 7 days on the hills of Samarcand, he retreated to the desert with only 60 horsemen. The fugitives were overtaken by 1,000 Getis, whom he repulsed with incredible slaughter, and his enemies were forced to exclaim, "Timur is a wonderful man. Fortune and the divine favor are with him." But in this bloody action his own followers were reduced to 10, a number which was soon diminished by the desertions of 3 Carizmians. He wandered in the desert with his wife, 7 companions, and 4 horses, and 62 days was he plunged in a loathsome dungeon, from whence he escaped by his own courage and the remorse of the oppressor. After swimming the broad and rapid stream of the Jihun or Oxus, he led during some months the life of a vagrant and outlaw on the borders of the adjacent states. But his fame shone brighter in adversity. He learned to distinguish the friends of his person, the associates of his fortune, and to apply the various characters of men for their advantage, and above all for his own. On his return to his native country, Timour was successively joined by the parties of his confederates, who anxiously sought him in the desert; nor can I refuse to describe, in his pathetic simplicity, one of their fortunate encounters. He presented himself as a guide to 3 chiefs, who were at the head of 70 horse. "When their eyes fell upon me," said Timour, "they were overwhelmed with joy, and they alighted from their horses, and they came and kneeled, and they kissed my stirrup. I also came down from my horse, and took each of them in my arms, and I put my turban on the head of the first chief, and my girdle, rich in jewels and wrought with gold, I bound on the loins of the second, and the third I clothed in my own coat. And they wept, and I wept also. And the hour of prayer was arrived, and we prayed, and we mounted our horses and came to my dwelling, and I collected my people and made a feast." His trusty bands were soon increased by the bravest of the tribes. He led them against a superior foe, and after some vicissitudes of war, the Getes were finally driven from the kingdom of Transoxiana. He had done much for his own glory, but much remained to be done, much art to be exerted, and some blood to be spilt, before he could teach his equals to obey him as their master. The birth and power of Emir Houssein compelled him to accept a vicious and unworthy colleague, whose sister was the best beloved of his wives. Their union was short and jealous, but the policy of Timour, in their frequent quarrels, exposed his rival to the reproach of injustice and perfidy; and, after a final defeat, Houssein was slain by some sagacious friends, who presumed, for the last time, to obey the commands of their lord. At the age of 34, and in a general diet or Couroultai, he was invested with imperial command; but he affected to revere the house of Zingis, and while the emir Timour reigned over Zagatai and the East, a nominal khan served as a private officer in the armies of his servant. A fertile kingdom, 500 miles in length and in breadth, might have satisfied the ambition of a subject; but Timour aspired to the dominion of the world, and before his death the crown of Zagatai was one of the 27 crowns which he had placed on his head. Without expatiating on the victories of 35 campaigns, without describing the lines of march which he repeatedly traced over the continent of Asia, I shall briefly represent his conquests in 1. Persia, 2. Tartary, and 3. India, and from thence proceeding to the more interesting narrative of his Ottoman war. 1. For every war, a motive of safety or revenge, of honor or zeal, of right or convenience, may be readily found in the jurisprudence of conquerors. No sooner had Timour reunited to the patrimony of Zagatai the dependent countries of Carizme and Candahar, than he turned his eyes towards the kingdoms of Iran or Persia. From the Oxus to the Tigris that extensive country was left without a lawful sovereign after the death of Abu Said, the last of the descendants of the great Holakau. Peace and justice had been banished from the land above 40 years, and the Mogul invader might seem to listen to the cries of an oppressed people. Their petty tyrants might have opposed him with confederate arms; they separately stood, and successively fell, and the difference of their fate was only marked by the promptitude of submission or the obstinacy of resistance. Ibrahim, prince of Shirwan or Albania, kissed the footstool of the imperial throne. His peace offerings of silks, horses, and jewels were composed, according to the Tatar fashion, each article of 9 pieces; but a critical spectator observed that there were only 8 slaves. "I myself am the 9th," replied Ibrahim, who was prepared for the remark, and his flattery was rewarded by the smile of Timour. Shah Mansur, prince of Fars, or the proper Persia, was one of the least powerful but most dangerous of his enemies. In a battle under the walls of Shiraz, he broke, with 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers, the Kul, or main body of 30,000 horse, where the emperor fought in person. No more than 14 or 15 guards remained near the standard of Timour. He stood firm as a rock, and received on his helmet 2 weighty strokes of a scimitar. The Moguls rallied, and the head of Mansor was thrown at his feet, and he declared his esteem of the valor of a foe by extirpating all the males of so intrepid a race. From Shiraz his troops advanced to the Persian Gulf, and the richness and weakness of Ormuz were displayed in an annual tribute of 600,000 dinars of gold. Bagdad was no longer the city of peace, the seat of the caliphs, but the noblest conquest of Holakau could not be overlooked by his ambitious successor. The whole course of the Tigris and Euphrates, from the mouth to the sources of those rivers, was reduced to his obedience. He entered Edessa, and the Turkmans of the Black Sheep were chastised for the sacrilegious pillage of a caravan of Mecca. In the mountains of Georgia, the native Christians still braved the law and the sword of Mohammed. By 3 expeditions he obtained the merit of the Ghazi, or Holy War, and the Prince of Teflis became his proselyte and friend. 2. A just retaliation might be urged for the invasion of Turkestan, or the Eastern Tartary. The dignity of Timour could not endure the impunity of the Getes. He passed the Sihoon, subdued the kingdom of Kashgar, and marched 7 times into the heart of their country. His most distant camp was 2 months' journey, or 480 leagues, to the northeast of Samarcand, and his emirs, who traversed the river Irtish, engraved in the forests of Siberia a rude memorial of their exploits. The conquest of Kipzak, or the Western Tartary, was founded on the double motive of aiding the distressed and chastising the ungrateful. Koktamish, a fugitive prince, was entertained and protected in his court. The ambassadors of Arus Khan were dismissed with a haughty denial, and followed on the same day by the armies of Zagatai, and their success established Toktamish in the Mogul empire of the north. But after a reign of 10 years, the new Khan forgot the merits and the strength of his benefactor, the base usurper, as he deemed him, of the sacred rights of the house of Zingis. Through the gates of Derbend he entered Persia at the head of 90,000 horse, with the innumerable forces of Kipzak, Bulgaria, Circassia, and Russia. He passed the Sihoon, burnt the palaces of Timour, and compelled him, amidst the winter snows, to contend for Samarcand and his life. After a mild expostulation and a glorious victory, the emperor resolved on revenge, and by the east and the west of the Caspian and the Volga, he twice invaded Kipzak with such mighty powers that 13 miles were measured with his right to his left wing. In a march of 5 months they rarely beheld the footsteps of man, and their daily subsistence was often trusted to the fortune of the chase. At length the armies encountered each other, but the treachery of the standard-bearer, who, in the heat of action, reversed the imperial standard of Kipzak, determined the victory of the Zagatais, and Toktamish, I speak the language of the institutions, gave the tribe of Toshi to the wind of desolation. He fled to the Christian Duke of Lithuania, again returned to the banks of the Volga, and after 15 battles with a domestic rival, at last perished in the wilds of Siberia. The pursuit of a flying enemy carried Timour into the tributary provinces of Russia. A duke of the reigning family was made prisoner amidst the ruins of his capital, and Yelets, by the pride and ignorance of the Orientals, might easily be confounded with the genuine metropolis of the nation. Moscow trembled at the approach of the Tartar, and the resistance would have been feeble, since the hopes of the Russians were placed in a miraculous image of the Virgin, to whose protection they ascribed the casual and voluntary retreat of the conqueror. Ambition and prudence recalled him to the south. The desolate country was exhausted, and the Mogul soldiers were enriched with an immense spoils of precious furs, of linen of Antioch, and of ingots of gold and silver. On the banks of the Don, or Tanais, he received a humble deputation from the consuls and merchants of Egypt, Venice, Genoa, Catalonia, and Biscay, who occupied the commerce and city of Tana, or Azoph, at the mouth of the river. They offered their gifts, admired his magnificence, and trusted his royal word. But the peaceful visit of an emir who explored the state of the magazines and harbor, was speedily followed by the destructive presence of the Tartars. The city was reduced to ashes, the Moslems were pillaged and dismissed, but all the Christians who had not fled to their ships were condemned either to death or slavery. Revenge prompted him to burn the cities of Sarai and Astrachan, monuments of rising civilization, and his vanity proclaimed that he had penetrated to the region of perpetual daylight, which authorized his Mohammedan doctors to dispense with the obligation of evening prayer. 3. When Timour first proposed to his princes and emirs the invasion of India or Hindustan, he was answered by a murmur of discontent. The rivers, and the mountains, and deserts, and the soldiers clad in armor, and the elephants, destroyers of men. But the displeasure of the emperor was more dreadful than all those terrors, and his superior reason was convinced that an enterprise of such tremendous aspect was safe and easy in the execution. He was informed by his spies of the weakness and anarchy of Hindustan. The Subas of the provinces had erected the standard of rebellion, and the perpetual infancy of Sultan Mahmud was despised even in the harem of Delhi. The Mogul army moved in 3 great divisions, and Timour observes with pleasure that the 92 squadrons of 1,000 horse most fortunately corresponded to the 92 names or epithets of the Prophet Mohammed. Between the Jejun and the Indus, they crossed one of the ridges of the mountains which are styled by the Arabian geographers the stony girdles of the earth. The highland robbers were subdued or extirpated, but great numbers of men and horses perished in the snow. The emperor himself was let down a precipice on a portable scaffold. The ropes were 150 cubits in length, and before he could reach the bottom, this dangerous operation was 5 times repeated. Timour crossed the Indus at the ordinary passage of Attock, and successively traversed in the footsteps of Alexander the Punjab, or 5 rivers, that fall into the master stream. From Attock to Delhi the high road measures no more than 600 miles, but the 2 conquerors deviated to the southeast, and the motive of Timour was to join his grandson, who had achieved by his command the conquest of Multan. On the eastern bank of the Hyphasis, on the edge of the desert, the Macedonian hero halted and wept. The Mogul entered the desert, reduced the fortress of Batnir, and stood in arms before the gates of Delhi, a great and flourishing city, which had subsisted 3 centuries under the dominion of the Mohammedan kings. The siege, more especially of the castle, might have been a work of time, but he tempted, by the appearance of weakness, the Sultan Mahmud and his vizier to descend into the plain, with 10,000 cuirassiers, 40,000 of his foot guards, and 120 elephants, whose tusks are said to have been armed with sharp and poisoned daggers. Against these monsters, or rather against the imagination of his troops, he condescended to use some extraordinary precautions of fire and ditch, of iron spikes, and a rampart of bucklers. But the event taught the Moguls to smile at their own fears, and as soon as these unwieldy animals were routed, the inferior species, the men of India, disappeared from the field. Timour made his triumphal entry into the capital of Hindustan, and admired, with a view to imitate, the architecture of the stately mosque, but the order or license of a general pillage and massacre polluted the festival of his victory. He resolved to purify his soldiers in the blood of the idolaters, or Gentoos, who still surpass, in the proportion of 10 to 1, the number of the Moslems. In this pious design he advanced 100 miles to the northeast of Delhi, passed the Ganges, fought several battles by land and water, and penetrated to the famous rock of Kupele, the statue of the cow that seems to discharge the mighty river whose source is far distant among the mountains of Tibet. His return was along the skirts of the northern hills, nor could this rapid campaign of 1 year justify the strange foresight of his emirs that their children in a warm climate would degenerate into a race of Hindus. It was on the banks of the Ganges that Timour was informed by his speedy messengers of the disturbances which had arisen on the confines of Georgia and Anatolia, of the revolt of the Christians, and the ambitious designs of the Sultan Bajazet. His vigor of mind and body was not impaired by 63 years and innumerable fatigues; and after enjoying some tranquil months in the palace of Samarcand, he proclaimed a new expedition of 7 years into the western countries of Asia. To the soldiers who had served in the Indian war he granted the choice of remaining at home or following their prince. But the troops of all the provinces and kingdoms of Persia were commanded to assemble at Ispahan, and await the arrival of the imperial standard. It was first directed against the Christians of Georgia, who were strong only in their rocks, their castles, and the winter season; but these obstacles were overcome by the zeal and perseverance of Timour. The rebels submitted to the tribute of the Koran; and if both religions boasted of their martyrs, that name is more justly due to the Christian prisoners, who were offered the choice of abjuration or death. On his descent from the hills, the emperor gave audience to the first ambassadors of Bajazet, and opened the hostile correspondence of complaints and menaces, which fermented 2 years before the final explosion. Between the two jealous and haughty neighbors, the motives of quarrel will seldom be wanting. The Mogul and Ottoman conquests now touched each other in the neighborhood of Erzeroum and the Euphrates, nor had the doubtful limit been ascertained by time and treaty. Each of these ambitious monarchs might accuse his rival of violating his territory, of threatening his vassals, and protecting his rebels; and in the name of rebels, each understood the fugitive princes whose kingdoms he had usurped, and whose life and liberty he implacably pursued. The resemblance of character was still more dangerous than the opposition of interest; and in their victorious career, Timour was impatient of an equal, and Bajazet was ignorant of a superior. The first epistle of the Mogul emperor must have provoked, instead of reconciling, the Turkish sultan, whose family and nation he affected to despise. "Dost thou not know that the greatest part of Asia is subject to our arms and our laws? That our invincible forces extend from one sea to the other? And that the potentates of the earth form a line before our gate? And that we have compelled Fortune herself to watch over the prosperity of our empire? What is the foundation of thy insolence and folly? Thou hast fought some battles in the woods of Anatolia, and contemptible trophies. Thou hast obtained some victories over the Christians of Europe. Thy sword was blessed by the apostle of God, and thy obedience to the precept of the Koran, in waging war against the infidels, is the sole consideration that prevents us from destroying thy country, the frontier and bulwark of the Moslem world. Be wise in time, reflect, repent, and avert the thunder of our vengeance, which is yet suspended over thy head. Thou art no more than a pismire. Why wilt thou seek to provoke the elephants? Alas, they will trample thee under their feet." In his replies, Bajazet poured forth the indignation of a soul which was deeply stung by such unusual contempt. After retorting the basest reproaches of the thief and rebel of the desert, the Ottoman recapitulates his boasted victories in Iran, Turan, and the Indies, and labors to prove that Timour had never triumphed unless by his own perfidy and the vices of his foes. "Thy armies are innumerable. Be they so. But what are the arrows of the flying Tartar against the scimitars and battle axes of my firm and invincible Janizaries? I will guard the princes who have implored my protection. Seek them in my tents. The cities of Arzingan and Erzeroum are mine, and unless the tribute be duly paid, I will demand the arrears under the walls of Taris and Sultana." The ungovernable rage of the sultan at length betrayed him to an insult of a more domestic kind. "If I fly from thy arms," said he, "may my wives be thrice divorced from my bed; but if thou hast not the courage to meet me in the field, mayest thou again receive thy wives after they have thrice endured the embraces of a stranger." Any violation by word or deed of the secrecy of the harem is an unpardonable offence among the Turkish nations; and the political quarrel of the two monarchs was embittered by private and personal resentment. Yet in his first expedition Timour was satisfied with the siege and destruction of Suvas or Sebaste, a strong city on the borders of Anatolia, and he revenged the indiscretion of the Ottoman on a garrison of 4,000 Armenians, who were buried alive for the brave and faithful discharge of their duty. As a Mussulman, he seemed to respect the pious occupation of Bajazet, who was still engaged in a blockade of Constantinople; and after this salutary lesson, the Mogul conqueror checked his pursuit, and turned aside to the invasion of Syria and Egypt. In these transactions, the Ottoman prince, by the Orientals, and even by Timour, is styled the Caesar of Rome, the Caesar of the Romans; a title which, by a small anticipation, might be given to a monarch who possessed the provinces, and threatened the city, of the successors of Constantine. Chapter 65.